Every Tuesday and Friday morning for the past 17 years, I've driven my 1967 Ford F-100 up the same logging road, parked at the same clearing, and walked the same half-mile trail to leave food at the old hollow cedar stump. My neighbors think I'm feeding stray dogs. My wife knows better but doesn't ask questions anymore. The truth is, I've been leaving food for the same creature since 1955, a being that most people believe is nothing more than a campfire story, but who I know to be as real as the mountains themselves. My name is James Miller, and I'm 53 years old. I've spent most of my life working timber in these Northern California forests, first as a logger, then as a foreman, and now in my semi-retirement as a consultant for the lumber companies. These woods are my home, have been since I was a boy. But it wasn't until the winter of 1955 that I truly understood I wasn't alone out here, that something else called these ancient forests home, something remarkable and deserving of respect. That Tuesday morning in September 1972 was crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that makes you grateful to be alive. I loaded my truck bed with the usual supplies, a burlap sack containing fresh apples from my orchard, smoked venison from last season's deer, a jar of honey from my neighbor's hives, and a loaf of bread my wife Helen had baked the day before. Simple offerings, but ones I knew would be appreciated. The drive up the logging road took 20 minutes, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks that had been there for decades. I passed the old Miller Timber Company sign, my father's company, closed now for 5 years since the big operations moved further north. The forests here were recovering, second-growth Douglas fir and cedar, reclaiming what had been clear-cut in my grandfather's time. I parked in the usual spot and shouldered my pack. The morning air smelled of pine needles and earth, and somewhere in the distance, a Steller's jay called out its harsh cry. I'd walked this trail so many times I could do it blindfolded, past the twin firs that had grown together, over the creek crossing where I'd replaced the old log bridge myself, and finally to the clearing where the ancient cedar stump stood. The stump was all that remained of a tree that must have been here for 500 years before it fell, probably in some winter storm decades ago. The hollow center was perfect for my purpose, protected from rain, hidden from casual hikers, and positioned at the edge of territory I'd come to recognize as his domain. I unpacked the offerings carefully, arranging them in the hollow as I always did. Then I stepped back, looked around at the familiar forest, and remembered the first time I'd come to this spot, 17 years and a lifetime ago. Winter 1955. I was 36 years old then, a senior logger with Miller Timber, working a section of old-growth forest about 2 miles from where I now stood. It was January, one of the coldest winters on record, with snow piled 3 feet deep in places and temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks on end. We were cutting cedar, valuable timber that would be used for shingles and siding, and I was working as part of a 3-man team. That particular afternoon, I'd been sent ahead to scout the next section we'd be cutting. My job was to mark the trees, plan the falling pattern, and make sure we wouldn't have any widowmakers, dead branches that could fall and kill a man when the main tree came down. It was solo work, quiet work, and I preferred it that way. I'd just finished marking a cluster of cedars when I heard it, a deep resonant call that echoed through the frozen forest. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar, not an elk. It had a quality that made the hair on my neck stand up, something that spoke to a primitive part of my brain that recognized the presence of something powerful and unknown. I stood perfectly still, listening. The call came again, closer this time, from somewhere in the dense undergrowth to the north. My first instinct was to head back to camp, to safety in numbers, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd spent my entire life in these woods and never heard anything like that sound. I moved quietly through the snow, following game trails when I could, pushing through brush when I had to. After about 15 minutes, I saw tracks. They were partially filled with fresh snow, but the shape was unmistakable. Footprints, easily 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes. They were deep, suggesting something very heavy, and spaced far apart, indicating a stride much longer than any humans. I followed the tracks for another 10 minutes until I reached a small clearing. And there, partially hidden behind a stand of young firs, I saw him for the first time. He was massive. I estimated at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe more. His body was covered in dark brown hair, longer and shaggier around the shoulders and upper back. He was facing away from me, crouched down beside what I realized was a fallen elk, partially buried in snow. The elk had probably died from the harsh winter, and he was examining it. No, he was doing something more deliberate. I watched, barely breathing, as he used his hands, and they were hands, not paws, to clear snow away from the carcass. But he wasn't eating. Instead, he seemed to be checking the elk carefully, and then he made a sound, a lower, softer version of the call I'd heard before. Within moments, 2 smaller figures emerged from the tree line on the far side of the clearing. They were juveniles, I realized, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, moving with less confidence than the adult, his offspring. And suddenly the whole scene made sense. He was a father, teaching his young how to find food during a brutal winter, how to scavenge safely. The adult made another sound, and the juveniles approached the elk carcass. He guided them, showing them how to feed, what parts were safe. I couldn't be sure, but it was clearly instruction, clearly teaching. This wasn't animal behavior. This was something much more sophisticated. I must have made some small sound, a boot crunching on snow, a sharp intake of breath, because suddenly the adult's head snapped toward my direction. For a moment, we made eye contact across the clearing. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with an awareness that sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. He didn't charge, didn't roar or display aggression. Instead, he gathered his young with a gesture that was unmistakably protective, and they moved quickly but calmly into the forest, disappearing within seconds. I stood there for a long time after they'd gone, trying to process what I'd witnessed. That evening, back at the logging camp, I said nothing to my crew. What could I say? That I'd seen Bigfoot? They'd have laughed me out of camp. But I couldn't stop thinking about that family, because that's what they were, a family, struggling to survive in the brutal cold, scrounging for food that was scarce and hard to find. The next morning, I packed extra food in my rucksack, sandwiches, jerky, some apples that were starting to wrinkle. During my lunch break, I hiked back to that clearing and left the food near where I'd seen them. I didn't know if they'd take it, didn't even know if they'd find it. But I had to try. 2 days later, I went back. The food was gone, and there were fresh tracks in the snow around where I'd left it, so I left more food, and more the week after that. Present day, September 1972. Standing at the old cedar stump, I smiled at the memory. That brutal winter of 1955 had been the beginning of something I never could have imagined. A relationship that had spanned nearly 2 decades, built on nothing more than regular offerings and mutual respect. Over the years, I'd learned his patterns, his preferences. He liked apples best, especially in fall when they were fresh. He'd take venison, but preferred it smoked rather than fresh. Honey was a special treat, and bread. He seemed to particularly enjoy Helen's homemade bread, which made my wife beam with pride even though she'd never admit to knowing who really ate it. I'd only seen him a handful of times since that first winter, maybe a dozen sightings in 17 years. He was cautious, intelligent, and very good at remaining hidden, but I knew he was there. The food was always taken, usually within a day or 2 of my leaving it, and sometimes I'd find small signs, a stack of stones that hadn't been there before, an arrangement of branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural. His way of acknowledging the gifts, perhaps, or maybe just coincidence. I preferred to think it was intentional. I was turning to leave when I heard something that made me stop. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps, coming from the direction I'd just walked. not trying to be quiet, not running, but moving with purpose, coming directly toward me. My heart rate picked up. In 17 years, he'd never approached while I was actually present. We had an unspoken agreement. I left food, he stayed hidden, but something was different today. He stepped into the clearing, and even though I'd seen him before, the sight still took my breath away. He was older now. I could see it in the graying patches around his muzzle and temples, in the slightly stooped way he carried his massive shoulders. But he was still imposing, still magnificent. I estimated he stood about 7 feet 8 inches tall, with arms that hung well past his knees and hands that could probably crush a man's skull without effort. We stood there, maybe 30 feet apart, neither of us moving. His dark eyes studied me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the one being examined, cataloged, understood. I'd waited 17 years for a moment like this, and now that it was here, I found I had no idea what to do. "Hello, old friend," I said quietly, keeping my voice low and calm. "It's just me, James, same as always." He tilted his head slightly at the sound of my voice, a gesture that was remarkably human. Then he did something that shocked me. He raised one massive hand and gestured, not randomly but deliberately. He pointed at the food in the cedar stump, then at himself, then made a motion that looked like he was cradling something in his arms. I stared, my mind racing to interpret. He was trying to communicate. After 17 years of silent acceptance, he was trying to tell me something. He repeated the gesture, more emphatically this time. Food, himself, cradling motion. And then it clicked. He was asking for more food, not for himself, but for something he was caring for. A child? Was one of his offspring injured or sick? "You need more food?" I asked, pointing at the offerings I'd brought. "For someone else?" He nodded, an actual nod, clear and unmistakable. Then he held up his hands, trying to show me quantity, more than usual, much more. My mind went to the obvious conclusion. One of his family was in trouble, but he'd come to me, trusted me enough to break our long-established pattern because he knew I'd help. The weight of that trust settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. "I understand," I said. "I'll bring more. Tomorrow. Twice as much as usual." He made a low rumbling sound, not threatening, almost grateful. Then he turned to leave, but paused and looked back at me one more time. His expression, if I could read it at all, seemed to carry both thanks and something else. Worry, perhaps. Then he disappeared into the forest as silently as he'd arrived, leaving me standing alone in the clearing with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I drove home faster than usual, my mind spinning with possibilities. Helen was in the kitchen when I arrived, working on her weekly canning. Jars of pickles and preserves lined the counter, and the smell of vinegar and spices filled the air. "You're back early," she observed, not looking up from the cucumber she was slicing. "Everything all right?" "Helen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not ask me why." That got her attention. She set down her knife and turned to face me, wiping her hands on her apron. We'd been married for 28 years, and she knew me well enough to recognize when something significant was happening. "What do you need?" "I need to put together a lot of food, more than usual. Bread, preserved meat, fruit, whatever we can spare. I need it by tomorrow morning." She studied my face for a long moment. "This is about your Tuesday and Friday trips, isn't it? About whatever it is you've been feeding all these years?" I nodded. "Something's wrong. I can't explain more than that, but I need to help." Helen had never pressed me for details about my feeding routine, had accepted it as one of my eccentricities, even when I knew she was curious. Now she made a decision that I'd always love her for. She simply nodded. "I'll bake more bread tonight. We've got 2 smoked hams in the cellar from last spring. There's that wheel of cheese from the Hendersons, and I can spare some of my preserves. Will that be enough?" "More than enough, thank you." She returned to her canning, but as I turned to leave, she said quietly, "James, whatever it is you're doing up there, I'm proud of you. I don't need to understand it to know it's important." That evening, I couldn't settle. I sat on the porch of our small house, smoking my pipe, a habit Helen tolerated as long as I stayed outside, and watching the sun set over the mountains. Our property sat at the end of a dirt road 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but forest stretching to the horizon. It was the isolation I'd always loved, the sense of living on the edge of wilderness. But tonight, that wilderness felt different. Somewhere up there in those mountains, something was wrong. A family I'd been quietly supporting for 17 years was in trouble, and I was the only human being who knew or cared. I thought about the juveniles I'd seen that first winter in 1955. They'd be adults now, probably with families of their own. Had they stayed in the area, did they know about the food I left? Was one of them the one who needed help now? The next morning, I loaded my truck with more supplies than I'd ever brought before. Helen had outdone herself: 4 loaves of fresh bread wrapped in cloth, 2 full hams, the entire wheel of cheese, jars of preserves, a basket of apples and pears from our orchard, and a large tin of the molasses cookies she usually saved for church socials. I added smoked fish I'd put up last spring and a bag of walnuts from our trees. The drive up the logging road felt longer than usual. When I reached the clearing and started down the trail, I found myself walking faster, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't quite explain. I reached the cedar stump and began unpacking. There was too much to fit in the hollow, so I stacked additional food on a flat rock nearby, covering it with cedar boughs to protect it from rain and keep it less visible to any chance hikers. As I worked, I became aware of being watched. I didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, just continued arranging the food carefully. When I finished, I stepped back and spoke to the forest. "It's all here. More tomorrow if you need it. Whatever's wrong, I hope this helps." I turned to leave and saw him, just a shadow in the dense undergrowth about 50 feet away. He didn't approach, but he raised one hand in what might have been a wave or gesture of thanks. I returned the gesture and headed back down the trail. Over the next week, I made the trip every day instead of my usual Tuesday and Friday schedule. Each time the food was gone, taken usually within hours of my leaving it. I brought everything I could spare. Helen raided our cellar and pantry, and I supplemented with fresh fish from the creek and additional game I hunted specifically for this purpose. On the 8th day, something changed. When I arrived at the cedar stump, the food from the day before was still there, untouched. My first thought was worry. Had something happened? Was the situation worse than I'd thought? Then I noticed something else. A pile of objects had been left on the flat rock where I usually stacked the extra food. I moved closer to examine them, and my throat tightened with emotion. There were gifts, carefully arranged gifts. A nearly perfect arrowhead, the kind the native peoples had made centuries ago, probably found deep in the forest. 3 eagle feathers tied together with thin strips of bark, a piece of quartz crystal, clear and beautiful, and most touching of all, a small carved figure, crude but recognizable, of a human and a larger figure standing side by side. He was saying thank you. In his way, with things he valued, he was expressing gratitude. I was still standing there looking at these offerings when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find him standing at the edge of the clearing, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a younger individual, probably in their late teens or early 20s, if I could judge such things. About 6 feet 9 inches tall, with lighter brown hair and a lankier build. And this younger one was holding something, cradling it carefully in their arms. As they moved closer, I realized what it was: a baby, a tiny infant, covered in fine dark hair, its eyes barely open. The young adult was holding it with obvious care, but there was something in their posture that spoke of exhaustion, of struggle. The older one, my longtime friend, gestured to the young one, who carefully laid the infant on a soft bed of moss they'd apparently prepared earlier. Then the older one pointed at the baby, then at the food, then made a gesture I interpreted as eat or feed. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't about an injury or illness. The young one was a new mother, probably gave birth recently, and was struggling to produce enough milk. The baby was hungry, weak. They needed supplemental nutrition, not just for the mother to eat, but something the infant could consume directly. "The baby's not getting enough to eat," I said, more to myself than to them. "The mother needs more calories, and the little one needs..." "What? Milk? Something easier to digest than meat?" Both creatures watched me intently. I thought quickly. "I can bring goat's milk. We have neighbors with goats. And soft foods, mashed fruits, honey mixed with water, things a baby could handle." The older one seemed to understand my tone, if not my exact words. He nodded, that same clear gesture of affirmation. "I'll be back this afternoon," I promised, "with different food, better food for a baby and a new mother." As I turned to hurry back to my truck, I glanced back one more time. The older one had crouched beside the infant, one massive hand gently stroking the tiny creature's head with surprising tenderness. The young mother watched with exhausted eyes. I had work to do, and for the first time in 17 years, I truly understood the depth of trust these beings had placed in me. They'd shown me their most vulnerable member, their newest generation, and they were trusting me to help them survive. I drove down the mountain faster than was probably safe, my truck bouncing over ruts as I headed straight for the Henderson farm, 3 miles from my property. Ed and Martha Henderson had been our neighbors for 15 years, running a small dairy operation with a dozen goats and selling milk and cheese to the local community. If anyone would have what I needed, it was them. Martha was in the barn when I arrived, mucking out stalls while the goats grazed in the pasture beyond. She looked up in surprise when I appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from my hurried drive. "James Miller, what on earth?" "Martha, I need to buy goat's milk, as much as you can spare, fresh if possible." She set down her pitchfork, wiping her hands on her work apron. "Goat's milk? You feeling poorly? Helen okay?" "Everyone's fine. I need it for something." I pulled out my wallet. "I'll pay whatever you ask, and I'll need more regularly, maybe twice a week for a while." Martha studied me with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd lived in rural California her entire life and knew when not to ask too many questions. "I've got about 3 gallons I was planning to make into cheese. You can have 2 gallons for $3, and I'll set aside the same amount each Tuesday and Friday if you want to pick it up regular like." "That's perfect. Thank you, Martha." She went to the cooling shed and returned with 2 glass jugs of milk, still cool from the morning's milking. As I loaded them carefully into my truck, she called out, "James, whatever you're feeding up there in those woods, it must be mighty special for you to go to all this trouble." I paused, one hand on the truck door. "It is, Martha. More than I can explain." Back home, Helen had anticipated my needs. She'd mashed ripe bananas in a bowl, mixed honey with warm water in a jar, and strained some of her apple preserves into a container, removing any chunks that might be difficult for an infant to handle. "I thought about what a baby might need," she explained, arranging the items in a basket. "Soft foods, easy to digest. The goat's milk is good, it's gentler than cow's milk. And I boiled some water and let it cool, just in case you need to dilute anything." I looked at my wife, this practical, capable woman who'd stood by me for nearly 3 decades, and felt a surge of gratitude. "Have I told you lately that you're remarkable?" "Not lately enough," she replied with a small smile. "Now go. Whatever needs that food shouldn't have to wait." The drive back up the mountain took 45 minutes. When I reached the clearing and started down the trail, I carried the basket carefully, worried about spilling the precious milk. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. When I reached the cedar stump, I found them waiting. The older male stood at the edge of the clearing, while the young mother sat on the mossy ground, the infant cradled against her chest. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were half closed, and even from a distance I could see the strain in her posture. "I brought what I think you need," I said quietly, setting the basket down on the flat rock. "Goat's milk, it's good for babies, and soft foods the mother can eat to help her make more milk." I pulled out one of the glass jugs and a clean cloth Helen had packed. I soaked the cloth in milk, then held it up for them to see. "The baby can suck on this. It's how human mothers sometimes feed infants when they can't nurse." The older male watched intently, then made a low sound to the young mother. She didn't move at first, clearly wary of coming too close to me, but the baby made a weak mewling sound, and maternal instinct overcame caution. She slowly stood and approached, stopping about 10 feet away. I set the milk-soaked cloth on a clean rock, then backed away to give her space. She moved forward cautiously, picked up the cloth, and examined it. Then, with touching gentleness, she pressed it to the infant's mouth. The baby latched on immediately, sucking desperately. The young mother made a soft sound, relief maybe, or surprise. She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw something that transcended species, a mother's gratitude for help with her struggling child. Over the next hour, I showed them how to repeatedly soak the cloth in milk, how to feed the baby in small, careful amounts. The older male watched the entire process with intense focus, clearly memorizing every detail. When the infant finally seemed satisfied and dozed off, the young mother carefully settled back onto the moss, holding her child close. I unpacked the rest of the basket, the mashed bananas, the honey water, the strained preserves. The older male approached and examined each item, smelling them carefully. Then he picked up the bowl of mashed banana and brought it to the young mother. She ate slowly, carefully, clearly hungry, but forcing herself to take small amounts. "I'll bring more tomorrow," I promised. "Same time. Milk, soft foods, whatever you need." The older male met my eyes and made that now familiar nodding gesture. But then he did something new. He touched his chest, his massive hair-covered chest, with one hand. Then he made a sound. "Tamra." I blinked in surprise. Was he telling me his name? After 17 years, he was giving me his name? I touched my own chest. "James," I said clearly, then pointed at him. "Tamra?" He nodded emphatically, then pointed at the young mother. "Keisha," then at the infant. "Ni-ah." Names. He was giving me their names, trusting me with this personal information, this recognition of their individuality. "Tamra, Keisha, Ni-ah," I repeated, committing them to memory. "I understand. I'll take care of them. I promise." Tamra studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression he understood far more of my words than I'd ever given him credit for. Then he made a gesture toward the forest, not dismissive, but indicating I should leave. They needed privacy, time to rest, and care for the baby without the stress of my presence. I gathered my empty basket and headed back down the trail. But before I left the clearing, I looked back one more time. Tamra stood watching me, a guardian protecting his family. He raised one hand, that gesture that might have been a wave or acknowledgement, and I returned it before disappearing into the trees. That night, I sat at our kitchen table with Helen, drinking coffee and trying to explain without really explaining. "It's a family," I said finally, "a mother and baby who need help. The father came to me because he knew I'd been leaving food all these years. He trusted me." Helen reached across the table and took my hand. "And you're going to help them?" "I have to. That baby." "Helen, she's so small, so fragile. Without help, I don't think she'll make it." "Then we'll help," Helen said firmly. "I'll keep making soft foods, and we'll get milk from Martha twice a week, like you arranged. How long do you think they'll need support?" "I don't know. Weeks? Months? Until the mother gets her strength back and the baby is strong enough. Then that's what we'll do." She squeezed my hand. "James, I've known for years you were doing something important up there. I'm glad I finally understand a bit more about what it is." Bun. I returned to the clearing every day for the next 2 weeks. Each visit followed the same pattern. I'd bring milk and soft foods, Tamra would be waiting, and Keisha would carefully feed little Naya with the milk-soaked cloth. The baby grew stronger day by day, her cries becoming more robust, her eyes brighter and more alert. Keisha gradually lost her initial wariness of me. By the end of the first week, she would feed Nia while I was still present, no longer waiting for me to retreat. By the second week, she actually moved closer, allowing me to see the baby more clearly. Nia was remarkable, covered in fine dark hair like both her parents, with tiny fingers that would grasp at anything that came near them, including once grasping my finger when I got too close. The strength in that tiny hand was surprising, promising that she'd grow into the same powerful build as her family. On the 15th day, something changed. When I arrived at the clearing, Tamra was there as usual, but he wasn't alone. 2 other adults stood with him, one slightly smaller, with more reddish-tinted hair, and another nearly as large as Tamra himself, with darker, almost black hair. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, uncertain. Were these more family members, friends? The sudden presence of 3 large adults instead of 1 was intimidating, even though I'd never felt threatened by Tamra. Tamra made a low, rumbling sound and gestured for me to approach. Then he pointed at the reddish-haired individual and made a sound, Ko-Ren. Then at the dark-haired one, Matek. More names. He was introducing me to others of his kind. The realization hit me like a physical force. Tamra wasn't just showing me his immediate family. He was integrating me into his wider community, introducing me to others as someone who could be trusted. After 17 years of patient relationship building, I was being accepted, not just tolerated, but truly accepted, as a friend to his people. I touched my chest. "James," I said, then gestured to encompass all of them. "Friends." Tamra nodded, and I swear there was something like satisfaction in his expression. Then all 3 of them stepped back, melting into the forest, leaving me alone in the clearing with my basket of supplies and the overwhelming knowledge that I'd just been granted something incredibly rare: formal acceptance into a hidden community that most humans would never even know existed. The autumn rains came early that year, turning the logging roads into muddy channels and making my twice-weekly trips more challenging. My Ford F-100 struggled through the worst sections, tires spinning in the slick clay, but I always made it through. I'd promised to help, and a little mud wasn't going to stop me. By the end of October, Nia had transformed. The tiny, weak infant I'd first seen was now robust and active, no longer dependent on the milk-soaked cloths. Keisha had regained her strength, and her milk had come in fully. But I continued bringing supplies, partly because they still needed supplemental nutrition, but mostly because the relationship had evolved beyond simple necessity. The clearing by the cedar stump had become a meeting place. Not every visit, but often enough. Tamra would be there, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ko-Ren or Matek. We'd developed a routine of sorts. I'd arrive with supplies, arrange them carefully, and we'd spend time in what I can only describe as companionable silence. Sometimes Tamra would show me things, a particularly interesting rock formation, tracks from other animals, once even a bee's nest he'd found, knowing I appreciated honey. It was during one of these visits in late October that Tamra did something that revealed just how much he'd been observing me over the years. I'd brought my thermos of coffee, as I often did, and was pouring myself a cup when he approached and made a gesture, bringing his cupped hand to his mouth, then pointing at my thermos. He wanted to try it. I hesitated, not sure if coffee would agree with his system, but his expression was curious, almost eager. I poured a small amount into the thermos cup and handed it to him carefully. His massive fingers handled the small cup with surprising delicacy. He sniffed it first, his nose wrinkling at the strong smell, then took a cautious sip. His face contorted in what I interpreted as displeasure, and he made a sound that might have been their equivalent of ugh. But then he took another sip as if trying to understand why I enjoyed it. After a third sip, he handed the cup back and made a gesture that clearly meant not for me. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The expression on his face had been so human-like in its skeptical assessment. And then Tamara did something that shocked me even more. He made a sound that was unmistakably laughter, deep, rumbling, but definitely expressing amusement at his own reaction to the coffee. It was a moment of pure connection, of shared humor across species. And it made me realize just how much we'd both changed since that first winter in 1955. The following Tuesday, I arrived to find something different. Tamra was there with Mahtek, and both of them seemed agitated. They were making urgent vocalizations to each other, gesturing toward the north, and when I appeared, Tamra immediately approached me with obvious purpose. He grabbed a stick and began drawing in the soft earth beside the cedar stump. First, he drew simple stick figures representing his people. Then, he drew what looked like rectangular shapes, vehicles or buildings, I thought. He drew lines connecting them, possibly roads, and then he drew symbols that looked like X's over some of the stick figures. Danger, threat. Something involving vehicles or humans was threatening his people. "What's wrong?" I asked, wishing desperately that we had better means of communication. "Someone's threatening your family?" Tamra gestured emphatically at the drawing, then pointed north and made an urgent sound. He wanted me to follow, to see something, but he also seemed conflicted, looking between me and the north, then back at his drawing, as if weighing whether to trust me with something more. I made a decision. "I'll follow you. Show me what's wrong." Tamra studied me for a long moment, then nodded. He and Matek began moving through the forest, and I followed, struggling to keep up with their long strides and natural ability to navigate the dense undergrowth. We traveled north for nearly an hour, climbing higher into the mountains, into territory I'd rarely explored. Finally, we reached a ridge that overlooked a valley I recognized. It was part of the old timber company lands, areas that had been logged in the 1950s and were now in various stages of recovery. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Below, a clearing had been cut into the forest. Temporary structures had been erected, trailers, equipment sheds, vehicles, and men were working, setting up what looked like a base camp. But this wasn't a logging operation. The equipment was wrong. Survey gear, scientific instruments, cages, large reinforced cages. I pulled my binoculars from my pack, old Army surplus binocs I'd carried since my service in World War II. Through the lenses, I could read some of the lettering on the vehicles. Pacific Northwest Zoological Research Initiative. My stomach turned. Someone was planning a capture operation, and given the size of those cages, they weren't hunting for bears or cougars. Beside me, Damra made a low, worried sound. He pointed at the camp, then at himself and Matek, then made a gesture of being trapped, hands coming together like closing a cage. He understood exactly what those men were planning. "How did they know?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. "How did they know you're here?" Then I remembered. The Patterson-Gimlin film. It had been shot just a few years ago in 1967, about 150 miles from here. The footage had sparked renewed interest in Bigfoot, and researchers had been combing the Pacific Northwest ever since. Maybe they'd found tracks, evidence, something that led them here. I studied the camp below, my mind racing. There were maybe a dozen men, professional setup, clearly planning to stay for a while. They had the resources and determination of people who believed they were close to a major discovery. "I won't let them take you," I said quietly. "Any of you." Tamra looked at me, and I saw both hope and doubt in his expression. What could one middle-aged logger do against an organized research team? "I need to think," I said, "but I'll figure something out. I promise." We made our way back to the clearing in silence. Before Tamra left, he touched my shoulder, that gesture of connection we'd developed, and made a sound that I'd come to recognize as his way of saying my name, James SSS. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Helen, a topographic map spread between us and a cup of coffee growing cold in my hand. "There has to be a way to get them to leave," Helen said, studying the map. "What if we reported them for trespassing? Some of that land is still technically under Miller Timber Company ownership, isn't it?" "Parts of it, yes. But the area where they're set up looks like it's on federal land. They probably have permits for wildlife research." I rubbed my tired eyes. "Even if we got them evicted from that spot, they'd just move to another location. They're determined." "What about the Forest Service? Don't they have regulations about this kind of thing?" "They'd need evidence of illegal activity, and if I report it, they'll ask too many questions about how I know what's going on in such a remote area." I couldn't risk drawing official attention to Tamra's territory. Helen was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. "What if you scared them off?" "Scared them?" "These researchers, they're looking for proof of something they've never seen up close, right? They're probably nervous, jumpy. What if they started having problems, equipment failures, strange noises at night, things that made them think they were in over their heads?" I looked at my wife with new appreciation. "You're suggesting I sabotage their operation." "I'm suggesting you protect a family that's depending on you." She met my eyes steadily. "James, you've spent 17 years building trust with these beings. That's not something you can just walk away from because it gets complicated." She was right. I'd made a commitment, whether I'd intended to or not, back in 1955 when I'd left that first food offering. And Tamra had trusted me enough to show me his most vulnerable family member, to introduce me to his community, to ask for help when danger threatened. "I'll need to be careful," I said slowly. "If they catch me, I could face serious legal trouble." "Then don't get caught." Helen squeezed my hand. "You know those woods better than anyone. You've got skills those city researchers don't have. Use them." Over the next 2 days, I planned carefully. I studied the camp's layout through binoculars from various vantage points, noting shift changes, routines, and vulnerabilities. The research team was professional but not military. They had security protocols, but nothing I couldn't work around. On the third night, under a new moon that left the forest in near total darkness, I made my first move. I'd brought wire cutters, a wrench, and knowledge of equipment that came from decades of working in the timber industry. I knew how to disable machinery in ways that looked like mechanical failure rather than sabotage. Their generator went first, a loosened fuel line that would cause it to run for a few hours before sputtering out. Then I moved to their survey equipment, making small adjustments that would throw off their measurements, make their data unreliable. I loosened bolts on their trailer hitches, repositioned their trail cameras to point at nothing useful. And finally, I took their radio antenna and bent it just enough to interfere with reception without being obviously damaged. Throughout it all, I was acutely aware that I was committing crimes, vandalism, trespassing, destruction of property. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of Nia's tiny hand grasping my finger, of Keishaw's exhausted gratitude, of Tamra's trust in showing me his community. Some things were worth the risk. The research team lasted 2 more weeks after my first night of sabotage. Each subsequent visit to their camp revealed increasing frustration and deteriorating morale. Equipment kept failing at crucial moments. Their generator required constant repairs. Radio communications were unreliable. And perhaps most unsettling for them, they started experiencing what they interpreted as genuine Bigfoot activity, sounds in the night, massive footprints appearing near their camp, and trees marked with claw-like scratches. I can't take credit for all of it. Tamra understood what I was trying to do after that first night, and he contributed his own campaign of psychological warfare. He and his people moved through the forest around the camp at night, making vocalizations that echoed through the darkness, breaking branches, and generally creating an atmosphere of being watched by something large and potentially hostile. The researchers wanted proof of Bigfoot's existence, but they wanted it on their terms, controlled, documented, safe. What they got instead was the reality of sharing territory with intelligent beings who didn't want to be captured, who were protecting their home, and who had an ally working against the research team from within. On the 15th night, I watched from my usual vantage point as the team held what appeared to be a heated meeting around their campfire. Even from a distance, I could see the gestures, the obvious arguments. 2 days later, they began breaking down the camp. By the end of the week, they were gone, leaving only tire tracks in the mud and some trash they'd failed to police properly. I hiked down to the abandoned campsite the day after they left, collecting the litter they'd left behind: candy wrappers, cigarette butts, pieces of broken equipment. It felt important to erase the evidence of their presence, to restore the area to its natural state. When I returned to the cedar stump clearing the next day, I found Tamra waiting with what I'd come to recognize as his entire extended family. Besides those I'd already met, there were 3 more adults and 2 juveniles, younger than Nia but old enough to walk on their own. They stood in a semicircle at the edge of the clearing, watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Tamra stepped forward and made a gesture I'd never seen before. He placed both hands over his heart, then extended them toward me, palms up. It was ceremonial, deliberate, and clearly meaningful. The others repeated the gesture in unison. "You're welcome," I said quietly, my throat tight with emotion. "You'd have done the same for me." And the remarkable thing was, I believed that. They would have. They'd been doing it in their way for thousands of years, helping lost hikers, guiding confused travelers, protecting human children who wandered too far from campsites. They'd been guardian angels in the wilderness, invisible and unacknowledged. Tamra approached and placed something in my hands. It was another carving, more elaborate than the first one I'd received. This one showed multiple figures, large and small, arranged in a circle around a single human figure: unity, community, acceptance. Over the following months, life returned to the rhythm we'd established before the crisis. My Tuesday and Friday visits continued, though the quantities of food decreased as Nia grew stronger and more independent. By the following spring, she was walking confidently, exploring the world with the boundless curiosity of a healthy toddler, always under the watchful eyes of her mother and extended family. Helen occasionally asked about my friends in the forest, as she'd come to call them. I'd share what I could, stories of Nia's development, Tamra's continued leadership of his group, the changing seasons in their territory. She never asked to meet them herself, understanding instinctively that the relationship I'd built was fragile and depended on careful boundaries. In June of 1973, on what marked 18 years since that first winter encounter, I arrived at the clearing to find an unexpected gathering. The entire community was there, at least a dozen individuals ranging from elderly adults with graying hair to young juveniles full of energy. They'd brought offerings of their own: perfectly shaped stones, woven grass mats, carved sticks with intricate patterns, and bundles of medicinal herbs I recognized from my years in the forest. Tamra stood in the center, and when he saw me, he made a vocalization that brought everyone to attention. Then, one by one, each member of the community approached me. They didn't touch, that seemed to be a boundary they maintained, but each one made the gesture Tamra had taught them, hands over heart, then extended toward me. It was a formal recognition, an acknowledgement of the relationship we'd built over nearly 2 decades. The eldest among them, an individual even larger than Tamra, with almost completely gray hair, approached last. He moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of advanced age, and when he stood before me, he made a sound that was remarkably close to friend. Then he touched his chest and made another sound, Tonka. The elder, the patriarch. He was giving me his name, the final seal of acceptance from the community's leadership. Tonka, I repeated, touching my own chest. James, I'm honored. We stood there for a moment, old, human, and old. What? I still didn't have adequate words for what they were. Not animals, not quite human, something else, something that existed in their own right, deserving of recognition and respect for what they were rather than what we might call them. The gathering dispersed gradually, family groups melting back into the forest. But Tamra remained, along with Keisha holding Nia, who was now a robust, active youngster with her mother's reddish tints in her hair. The family stood together, and I realized they wanted me to see them like this, healthy, thriving, together. They wanted me to know that my help had mattered, that Nia's survival was because of what we'd accomplished together. She's beautiful, I said, watching Nia try to climb a low branch while her mother gently guided her. You should be very proud. Tamra made a sound that I'd learned to interpret as agreement or satisfaction. Then he did something he'd never done before. He reached into what I can only describe as a natural pouch formed by longer hair on his lower back and pulled out an object wrapped in large leaves. He carefully unwrapped it and held it out to me. It was a photograph, faded, water-damaged, but unmistakable. A photograph from the 1950s showing a group of loggers standing in front of a massive cedar tree. And there, on the right side of the group, was a younger version of me grinning at the camera with an axe over my shoulder. I stared at it in shock. Where did you get this? Tamra pointed at himself, then made a gesture I interpreted as long ago and watching. He'd found this photograph somewhere, maybe blown from a truck, maybe left at an old logging camp, and he'd kept it. For years, maybe decades, he'd kept it because he recognized me. He'd been watching me, knowing who I was, long before I'd ever known he existed. The implications were staggering. Our relationship hadn't begun in 1955 with my first food offering. It had begun earlier, with him observing me, learning about me, deciding I was someone who could be trusted. When I'd left that first offering of food, he'd already known what kind of person I was. You've been watching over me, I said slowly, as much as I've been watching over you. Tamra's expression, if I was reading it correctly, seemed almost amused, as if to say, did you really think you were the only one paying attention all these years? I laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that echoed through the clearing. All this time, I'd thought I was being so careful, so observant. But they'd been studying me just as closely, making their own assessments, building their own understanding of who I was and whether I could be trusted. Thank you, I said, carefully taking the photograph, for trusting me, for letting me be part of your lives. Tamra placed his hand on my shoulder, that familiar gesture that had come to mean so much. Then he, Keisha, and Nia turned and walked into the forest, a family heading home after a long day. I stood in the clearing for a long time after they'd gone, the old photograph in my hands, thinking about everything that had happened since 1955. 18 years of Tuesday and Friday visits, 18 years of quiet offerings and unspoken communication. 18 years of building something that had no name, no precedent, no guidebook. It was simply a relationship. Across species, across the divide between known and unknown, between civilization and wilderness. Built on nothing more complicated than consistent kindness, mutual respect, and the recognition that we were all just trying to survive and protect the ones we loved. When I returned home that evening, Helen was waiting on the porch. I showed her the photograph, explained where it had come from, and watched her eyes fill with tears. 18 years, she said softly. They've been watching you for 18 years. Probably longer, I replied. This photo is from before I started feeding them. They chose me, Helen. I didn't find them. They found me and decided I was worth trusting. Then I'd say they're excellent judges of character. She squeezed my hand. Are you going to keep going, Tuesday and Friday visits? I looked out at the darkening mountains, at the forest that had been my life's companion, at the wilderness that held secrets most people would never imagine. As long as they'll have me, I said, as long as I'm able to make the drive and walk that trail. They're family now. Strange, unusual family, but family nonetheless. And that's what I did. Through the rest of the 1970s and into the 1980s, I maintained my Tuesday and Friday visits. I watched Nia grow into a strong, healthy young adult. I met new generations as they were born. I witnessed seasons change, years pass, and through it all, the relationship endured, built on something as simple as leaving food at a hollow cedar stump and recognizing that intelligence, compassion, and family love aren't exclusive to any single species. Some people spend their lives searching for proof of the extraordinary. I learned that sometimes the extraordinary finds you, and the greatest privilege isn't proving it exists. It's being trusted enough to become part of it.